On this episode of the Contagious Influencers of America podcast, well, have you ever wondered what it's like after living life here on earth? Does heaven exist? Well, we have somebody here that's going to make the case for heaven.
And then her spirit floated out of the hospital. But then it floated back into her body. Her body was revived. And then she said, by the way, there's a shoe on the roof of the hospital. And it's a left-footed man's tennis shoe. And there's some wear over the little toe. And the shoelace is tucked under the heel. They went up to the roof of the hospital and found it just as she described it.
And that's just part of the many incredible stories we're going to be hearing today. I'm David Sams, your host for CIA. My guests today are coming from the filmmaking and storytelling realm. First, we have New York Times best-selling author, a buddy of mine, Lee Strobel. He's going to be in the studio, and joining us will be filmmaker. I'm talking about director, producer, Manny Sandoval. Now, the two of them have teamed up to bring us something really special. Now, I'm sure you remember Lee from his best-selling book, The Case for Christ, and, of course, many other case books. But this one is extraordinary. It's called The Case for Heaven, and it's now been transformed into a film. And that film will be in theaters April the 4th through 6th. And that's something you're not going to want to miss, especially after this podcast. Now, this film delves into the most profound questions we all have about heaven. Lee will be attempting to prove that heaven does, in fact, exist. Now, he's also going to be talking to many people who've had near-death experiences. And I know we've seen these stories before, but man, you know, Lee, being the journalist that he is, he just didn't take people's word for it. He went out to prove that these people had near-death experiences and visions of what's on the other side. So I can't wait for you to hear what he has to report back to us. And these two, they put together an unbelievable film, just unfathomable events. And I can't wait for you to listen in on Lee and Manny. And they're going to be sharing about not only their case for heaven, but what it was like working together in some extraordinary circumstances. So this is going to be some fun. Before we get to the interview, it's hard to miss that prices for food, fuel, and homes are on the rise in our country right now. And interest rates, well, they're following. So don't hesitate to make a move to see if a cash-out refinance is for you. Why not give our friends at Fellowship Home Loans a call at 800-804-SAVE. That's 800-804-SAVE, 800-804-7283, and let them do a thorough check of the numbers and the market plus your obligations to determine the best path. You can also find them at fellowshiphomeloans.com. With the market being so uncertain, they will check to see if you can save, or it might make sense to hold on tight. The Fellowship Home Loans team will take the time to listen and help you live the dream for less. That's Fellowship Home Loans at 800-804-SAVE. That's 804-7283. Intercontinental Capital Group, DBA Fellowship Home Loans, Equal Housing Opportunity Lender, NMLS number 60134. And now joining me is Lee Strobel, along with Manny Sandoval. Hey, gentlemen, welcome. Welcome to the homestead.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Lee, you were here, when were you here last?
Oh, maybe a couple of years ago. I think pre-COVID.
Pre-COVID.
Everything is measured that way these days. Oh, yeah, it was pre-COVID.
In a world. The pre-COVID world.
Right.
Manny, we've never met before.
No, but I feel like I've met you somehow. I listened to your show here, so I'm excited to be here.
Fantastic. So let's we'll get to this new project in a minute. But how did you two meet?
Oh man, that's a long story. But we went through The Case for Miracles. Lee had that book, and we actually worked on a video project for that book. And I think there was synergy there. What I loved about Lee was he was willing to do, I guess, what I would say creative risks and endeavors. So if you look at the book trailer for that, we did that, and it was very creative. So I figured, he had just such a great background and knowledge. So when we apply like the creative backdrop to it, I just think some awesome things happen.
And I hit it off with Manny because I'm just so proud of him and his family. You know, Manny grew up, his family immigrated from Guatemala. They lived in poverty in the housing projects of South Central LA. His dad was a pastor of a small church. And then Manny and his brother Gil went off to Phoenix and started this company. They employ like 30 people, and they're making movies. They're working with major companies in terms of promotion and videos and all kinds of things. And I'm just proud of him. He's just a great guy who's overcome a lot, and his creativity has carried him.
Fantastic. So you two have collaborated on this new project that is out here shortly, and it's a case for heaven. Yeah. Now, Lee, I have to ask you, how many cases have you solved up to this point? What are we up to now?
Well, I started with the Case for Christ, and that's 25 years ago. I've done 40 books along the way, so a lot of them are on that theme: case for Christmas, case for Easter, case for the real Jesus, case for faith, case for miracles, and a case for grace. So a lot of different issues, and it's reflective of my background. I was a journalist, trained in law, and I was legal editor of the Chicago Tribune. So I tend to see things in those terms, in terms of what Christians call apologetics, or reasons for why we believe what we believe. And that's what brought me to faith from atheism, was the evidence historically for the resurrection of Jesus. And so I just love exploring evidence and facts and trying to make a case for the truth of Christianity, which is actually rather easy to do.
Well, I think you made the right choice, because your case studies, this career direction that you've taken has outlived the newspaper business. So.
Boy, that's true in a way. I see a couple of my friends stayed in the business, and they're just retiring now, but there's hardly anything left. Mm-hmm. When I left the Chicago Tribune, our daily circulation was almost 1 million. Now it's down to 400,000. Newspapers, I think this is actually a crisis for America. Newspapers are dying, and we need a free, robust press, and so I tend to worry about what's going to happen.
So when does a case for newspapers come out?
Hey, wait a minute, I'm writing that down. Thank you. I was running out of ideas.
So you two have collaborated on this case for heaven.
Yeah.
Why? First of all, why didn't you do this before? This seems like the obvious.
Yeah, in a way it is, but it was triggered because 10 years ago I almost died. My wife found me unconscious, called an ambulance. I remember waking up in the emergency room and looking up, and the doctor looked down at me and said, "You're 1 step away from a coma, 2 steps away from dying." And so I lingered between life and death for quite a while till they were able to save my life. I had a rare condition called hyponatremia, which is a severe drop in blood sodium level. And so it's a very clarifying experience when you are close to death like that, and you don't know, am I going to leave this world at any time? Now, I'm a Christian. I believe what the Bible teaches about that. But I also have the skeptical gear because of my journalism and legal background. And so when I recovered from that, I thought, how do I know the Bible's telling me the truth about what happens after we die? Is there credible evidence that indeed we do survive our physical demise? And that launched me on an investigation that resulted in the book, The Case for Heaven, and now the film. And they're two very different experiences. Somebody tweeted me the other day and said, "Hey, should I read the book or watch the movie?" I said, you kind of got to do both, because they're totally different experiences. The film, Manny's creativity, it is, you have to see it on a big screen. It's only in theaters 3 nights, April 4, 5, and 6, all over the country. But it's a beautiful film. The music is amazing. The cinematography is breathtaking. We traveled. We were talking earlier. How many cities did we go to?
20 plus cities, 50 plus days on the production. And you're right. The film, we made it for the theater. Like a lot of filmmakers, obviously we work hard. Distribution is always tough for a filmmaker. But when you create for the theater, one VP from Paramount once told me, you have to create the movie for the theatrical experience. Yeah. Because people are going out of the way. They're getting a babysitter. It's $14 to go out there. It takes a lot to go to the theater. I haven't been to the theater with my wife in a while. We have 2 kids. So when you get there, you have that one opportunity to take people somewhere. And that's what we're doing. We're trying to take people on this journey with us.
So we filmed from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco to Portland, Oregon to Houston, Texas, Louisiana, Chicago.
We got all the desert. So if you've never traveled, you're going to travel in this film.
It's a travel log.
It is. It's a travel journey, Doc.
And you know what's funny? He asked me, well, when you were growing up, what was your first car? I said, well, it was a 63 Volkswagen Beetle. And so he finds a 63 Volkswagen Beetle, and I'm driving this thing in the movie all over the country.
Yeah, Lee Strobel drove all the cars.
Yeah.
Home stunt driving. Yeah. If you want to see Lee Strobel drive really fast, come watch
he took me out to a desert near Las Vegas, and where they filmed car commercials. And I'm driving like 100 miles an hour through the desert in this minivan.
Wow.
And the dust is flying everywhere.
It looks like a car commercial. It's so cool.
So what took you to all these cities? What were you searching for?
Well, different angles. You know, one of the most fascinating aspects of the case for the afterlife, the case for heaven, is near-death experiences. I was a skeptic about them when I first began investigating them. But what I learned is there have been 900 scholarly articles written about near-death experiences in medical journals and scientific journals in the last 50 years. It's a very well-researched phenomenon. And The Lancet, which is a famous medical journal in England, did an article that said that none of the alternative explanations for near-death experiences can account for this phenomenon. Something is going on. So I looked at what can we corroborate. How do we know that when we die? You know, the Apostle Paul said to leave the bodies to be absent from the bodies to be present with the Lord. So Christians believe that when we die, our soul, our spirit separates from our physical body. We're in an intermediate state, awaiting final judgment. And when Jesus returns, there's a final resurrection, and then we're reunited with our resurrected body. And then final judgment happens where we go to a very physical heaven or a very physical hell. And so, how do we know that we have a spirit that survives our death? Well, there are some fascinating, we do this in the movie, there's some fascinating case reports. I'll give you an example of a woman named Maria who died in the hospital, clinically dead, and yet she says later, I was conscious the whole time. And she described how her spirit is separated from her body. She watched the resuscitation efforts take place as people tried to save her, and then her spirit floated out of the hospital. But then it floated back into her body. Her body was revived, and then she said, by the way, there's a shoe on the roof of the hospital, and it's a left-footed man's tennis shoe, and there's some wear over the little toe, and the shoelace is tucked under the heel. They went up to the roof of the hospital and found it just as she described it. That's the kind of corroboration I'm talking about. Things that people could not see or could not hear, could not experience if they didn't have an authentic out-of-body experience. Interestingly, there was one study done of 21 blind people, most of them blind since birth, and yet during the near-death experiences, they could see for the first time. They could see human beings trying to resuscitate them and so forth. First time they were able, and it was one researcher that this is medically impossible. But I think for Christians, what's important is John Burke, who's a Christian pastor, studied 1,000 near-death experiences over 30 years. And his conclusion is if you look at the commonality among near-death experiences, and you don't look at how people interpret it, but you look what actually takes place, it is consistent with Christian theology. And so that was kind of a breakthrough study that he did. And so we explore near-death experience in the movie. It'll blow your mind, the cases we talk about in the film.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, visually, it was like, how are we going to pull that off?
Yeah.
So we used 2D animation, hand-drawn illustrations. Our animation team did a fantastic job, Dan and the team. And I think what we were trying to do is, this is very supernatural.
Yeah.
I think even Christians are skeptical of this stuff.
Yeah.
But it's because it's supernatural. If it's supernatural, then it's hard to believe.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? We believe in miracles, right? We believe in these things, but when you truly hear some of these stories, you're like, how could this be? So we use the music, the sound design, and the animations to really bring this to life because it is very supernatural, and it's very interesting as well.
Yeah.
So tell me about one of the stories that you were blown away by.
From the near-death experiences?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think the one that was kind of the one you mentioned, I think, is because for me, I remember when you were telling me about near-death experiences, I was like, I don't really want to hear these stories because we see tons of films or books and you hear that there's some fraud in some of this. But when I learned what corroboration meant, it really changed the game. And I think there's so many supernatural things that happen, but we don't know how to explain them. So we fear them, and we say, that's not from God, or that can't be, right? I think John said something to the effect when we were interviewing that these are gifts from God. What I didn't know was millions of these are happening in America and all over the world. And more consistently, globally, these findings and commonalities are there globally. So basically, should we really think about this and really research it, or should we just keep fearing it? And I think the film really displays it, I think, intelligently.
Yeah, one of the stories we tell in the film is with a guy named Howard Storm. He's one of the 24% who have hellish experiences when they die. Howard was an atheist. He was an art professor and chairman of the art department at a secular university. He died in the hospital, and he had a horrific afterlife experience where he was literally torn apart by demons. It's even hard for him years later to talk about it, how horrific it was. He called out to God to rescue him. God did rescue him from it. This not only, when he did recover, he not only renounces atheism, he not only quit his tenured position at the university, he not only became a Christian, he became an ordained minister, and to this day is pastor of a small church now. It transformed his life. And then on the other side, we have there's a little girl, 8 years old, who drowned. Massive brain swelling, no brainwave activity. Her heart stopped beating for 20 minutes. She's clinically dead. They're keeping her body alive in the hospital till they decide what to do. But she said, I was alive the whole time. In fact, she said, one night, I followed my family home. They had come to visit me. I followed them home. And she described what they were wearing. She described what they made for dinner. She described our sister and brother, what toys they were playing with in the house. She described our dad was sitting sort of catatonic on the couch and so forth. Things that there's no way she could have known, and yet she described them in great detail. Because why? She had an authentic out-of-body experience. We're not just a physical body. We're a body and a soul, and our soul does survive our physical demise. One other study, scientific study, showed that they looked at 93 cases where people made these kind of verifiable observations in their out-of-body experience. 92% of these observations turned out to be absolutely 100% accurate. Another 6% were almost 100% accurate. So it's 98% accuracy. Something is going on. And I think that kind of corroboration gives us confidence that, the Bible tells the truth. To be absent from the body should be present with the Lord. There is an intermediate state that we go into. Now, these people are not permanently dead. They're going to come back, so they're not irreversibly dead, but they're clinically dead. No brain waves, no heart activity. Some have been declared dead. There was one woman who was being wheeled to the morgue. She's been declared dead. They were taken away to the morgue. And she comes to, and she's able to describe the ties that the doctors were wearing in the emergency room when they were trying to resuscitate her. And she was talking about the jokes they were telling to kind of ease the tension while they were trying to resuscitate her. So things she could not have possibly known. And yet she did and was able to recount them. So I think that this is good evidence that indeed there is life after our physical demise.
So based on your research, what take me through it. What happens when we're faced with this, when we die?
Yeah, when we die, our physical body dies, our spirit, our soul, our consciousness continues to live on. We are ourselves still. We have our same personality. We are same, we're cognizant of what's going on. We're either in the presence of God in that time period, if we're followers of Jesus. If we're not, we're separated from him. You think of the story that Jesus told, the parable with the rich man and Lazarus, indicating that they were conscious and alive and aware after their physical death. So we're in this intermediate state. It's a state where we wait until the final consummation of history when Jesus returns. At that point, we're reunited with our resurrected bodies. We go through final judgment, and then we go to eternity, either in a very physical heaven or a very physical hell. In my book, I deal with, I have 2 chapters on hell because I think it's important that we look at that theologically and practically. But then ultimately, earth, we have a new heaven, a new earth. It's a very physical place. And so we end up spending eternity there. The Bible uses a lot of figurative language about both heaven and hell. So it gives us glimpses into it. I think Manny did a great job in the film of creatively kind of hinting at some of the, because we're looking at different dimensions of time and so forth.
No, that's a great point. I was thinking about that because we're, wrapping up on the post-production for the theatrical. And one thing our colors told us is that when you look at color, there's colors you can't see. They exist, but our eyes can't actually see them.
Right.
And I think about heaven in the film a lot. I mean, it wasn't difficult because God created a beautiful landscape, you know what I mean? So we're only seeing a slither of what heaven's going to be. So all we had to do is point the camera in the right direction and let Lee do his thing, you know what I mean? So, but I think there's so much that we experience that we only have just a bit of a taste. I think someone described it as have you ever had that moment where time stops and you just feel like, wow, like it just, everything stops and you wish it could last longer? I've heard that that's what heaven is. That it never ends.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I'm not surprised because some of these things that you see, like the Grand Canyons, we should have filmed there. But,
yeah.
But anyways,
we filmed everywhere else.
There's still time. I'm just kidding. But no, your eyes can't grasp its magnitude.
Yeah, because on Earth, in our current lifetime, we see colors that are based on colors, the color spectrum of the light of the sun. In heaven, the color spectrum is based on the light of God. And so you have people in near-death experiences who will say, I saw colors of flowers and things. I can't describe them. They're not in this world. And so in heaven, we will see that color spectrum based on the light of God. We'll see colors that the Bible can't describe to us. So the Bible has to use kind of metaphors and similes and so forth to try to hint at the beauty and the wonder of what heaven's going to be like.
Did these folks report seeing loved ones or pets or what?
Often, one of the commonalities is that people will encounter loved ones who preceded them in death, which I think is very comforting. In fact, in my book, I interviewed a theologian who says that in the first hour of heaven, our first hour of heaven, will be a time of reconciliation, because. Think about it. We're probably in some sort of conflict right now with someone who's a believer. We may have had an argument with someone we didn't apologize for. We may, let's face it, we're sinners still. And so when we get to heaven, there's got to be a reconciliation of those issues. So I'll give you an example. My father was a Christian, and yet we had a very terrible relationship. And we never reconciled before he died. I believe he's in heaven. I believe when I get in heaven, we will both be 1,000% motivated to reconcile. We will talk to each other. We will admit our side of the problem. We will hug, and we will have a father-son relationship in heaven like which we never experienced on earth. So we'll have that moment of reconciliation in heaven. That's probably the first hour of heaven. Now, it may be instantaneous. We don't know. But it has to happen because we can't be in conflict with anybody who's also going to be in heaven with us. So there's these interesting dynamics. You mentioned pets, and it's controversial whether our pets will be in heaven. Certainly there'll be animals in heaven. We know that from Scripture. Will our pets be in heaven? And that's, you get a division among Christian scholars who say, some say yes, some say no. Our animals, by the way, do have souls. The Bible indicates that, but they're not made in the image of God, so it's not as developed as our human soul. But as Johnny Erickson Tata said when she talked about whether her dog Scrappy would be in heaven, she said, we just like God in His grace and in His sense of humor, and to allow us to experience the pets who we love so much in this world. So I think the likelihood is that our pets will be there. I hope so.
So what do you say to the folks who just say, heaven is just it's too good to be true?
Well, I think there's three areas, and we deal with this in the film, that point toward the reality of heaven, that it is true. Number one, the existence of the soul. And Manny went all the way over to England to interview Dr. Sharon Diricks, who's a neuroscientist from Cambridge University, who talks in the film quite convincingly about the fact that we're not just a physical body, but we have a soul as well. So that's established. Then the near-death experience tells us that indeed that soul can and does survive our clinical death. How long, we don't know from that, but we know that it does survive our physical death. And then we look at the resurrection of Jesus, because if Jesus really died and really was resurrected, then number one, he's an eyewitness to the afterlife, so we ought to pay attention to what he says about it. But number two, it also demonstrates he's the Son of God. Therefore, he created the afterlife, and we really ought to pay attention to what he says about it. So he has credibility like no one else. So those are kind of the three areas we look at. Can we be confident Jesus was resurrected? Yeah, I think we really can. That's what brought me from atheism to faith in Christ, was the historical evidence that he rose from the dead.
And what is that?
Oh, golly. I'll give it to you really quickly. 4 areas. I use 4 words that begin with the letter E. Execution. Was he dead when he was crucified? Absolutely. We have no record anywhere of anyone ever surviving a full Roman crucifixion. Even the Journal of the American Medical Association carried an investigation into the death of Jesus and said, quote, clearly, the weight of the historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead even before the wound to his side was inflicted. We have 5 ancient sources outside the Bible confirming that Jesus was dead. So Jesus was dead. The second E stands for early. We have early reports that he rose from the dead. In other words, reports that come so quickly they can't be legend. It took time for legend to develop in the ancient world. So we have a report in 1 Corinthians 15, chapter 3, named eyewitnesses and groups of eyewitnesses who encountered the resurrected Jesus. That report has been dated back by scholars to within months of the death of Jesus. Far too early to be a legend. Third, we have an empty tomb. And the reason we know the tomb was empty is even the opponents of Jesus implicitly admitted it was empty. So everybody admitted the tomb was empty. And then finally, fourth, eyewitnesses. Most of the facts that we agree are true about the ancient world are based on 1 or 2 good sources. And yet, for the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the resurrected Jesus, we have no fewer than 9 ancient sources, inside and outside the New Testament, confirming and corroborating the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the risen Christ. That is an avalanche of historical data. And so, I was trained at Yale Law School on evidence. I was legal editor of the Chicago Tribune. I spent 2 years of my life as an atheist trying to disprove the resurrection until I looked at the evidence and came to the conclusion that it would take more faith to maintain my atheism in light of the evidence than to become a Christian. And this is what brought me to faith. So we talk about that kind of evidence in the film, and I think it leaves people with confidence that, yes, we all want heaven to be true. But is it wishful thinking? Is it just blind faith? No, we have good evidence that it is true.
And what evidence do we have that hell is real?
Well, first of all, because
I realize that's the next book, but
yeah, I'm writing that down too. Well, first of all, because Jesus did demonstrate by his resurrection that he is who he claimed to be, the unique Son of God, he teaches about hell more than anybody in the Bible, and he talks about it. And so I think we can trust what he says. If he indeed was resurrected, as we show he was, we can trust what he tells us about hell.
And I want to add something, Lee. From my perspective, I've been a Christian my whole life. I've always believed. So when Lee talks about this evidence and all these things, I mean, to be poetic, I think that this is like the poetry to our faith. It's the thing that kind of like, when you play music and you're doing it really well, but then you start learning the theory and it starts putting everything together. I think that's what Lee does. So when you talk about like, how do you explain this and that? Well, I think Jesus is the biggest piece of the puzzle for me, because if he existed, then we trust what he says. But most people get hung up on that. A lot of us go, or I hear a lot, especially friends of mine, well, Jesus is a great guy. I love his advice. I think he, that's a model to live life. But when it comes to, is he the Son of God? That's where that's the blockage right there. So I think what we're trying to do in this film is honestly provide an opportunity for Christians to learn something that I believe that we might not know. Because I didn't know a lot of this stuff. We talk science, philosophy, history. I felt a little embarrassed and ashamed that I didn't know a lot of this stuff, But then for those who are spiritually seeking, I think it's an opportunity to really think about this stuff and say, in one way, maybe understand your significant other or your friend that, oh, this is why they believe what they believe, right? Or it might help answer one question. So they have fewer questions left, you know what I mean? So it's just an opportunity.
Boy, that is so good, because what you just said about a seeker, someone who's not a believer. I hope that Christians will take a risk and invite their non-believing friends to the film to see the movie, because I think seeing it, you see this film on the big screen, and it tells so powerfully and so creatively the evidence that indeed we live on forever. The question is going to be, where are we going to live on forever? That this could be the turning point for a lot of people. I had tears in my eyes when I watched the movie for the first time about the story of Howard Storm, who went to hell in his near-death experience. As I felt so horrible for him. But it brings it home that this is reality. This is real. And
I'll add to that. So I think what we tried to do as well was we have a very diverse cast and guests.
Yeah.
So what it is everyone's journey is so unique, like how they find God, how they wrestle with these questions. A lot of them are very similar but different, like suffering. Like, why does God allow that? You know what I mean? Where is God? And, why can't I see him? And a lot of people end up saying, I want to see him. If he shows up, I'll believe. It's very common. No. So I think we use a lot of these stories as illustrations, you know what I mean? To show people to maybe see themselves on the screen. Yeah. And I think a lot about like what you're encouraging, Lee, for people to bring their friends or people that don't know who God is, or maybe had a negative experience. I'll take it further. Bring them. Why? Because if someone didn't provide the opportunity for my dad to hear the gospel, and that person didn't take that courageous faith to say, you know what, I'm gonna put my neck out here, I'm gonna invite them here, then I wouldn't be here. My kids wouldn't be here. And that person was my mother. Very similar story to you.
Yeah.
And Leslie. So what I would encourage people is, we did our best to make this accessible.
Yeah.
To make this entertaining. You know what I mean? I grew up in South Central LA, so 14 tickets are now $14, I think, for the theater. Like, that's a lot. You know what I mean? So we don't want to waste people's time. We want to give them something they haven't already heard, which I think, Lee, you've done a fantastic job. And we want to make it beautiful. I mean, come on. If we're talking about heaven, that's probably it will probably be the most important film I ever do. Because look at the subject matter. You know what I mean? So if we're going to make a movie about heaven, then we got to go big.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things we have in the movie is I had the last interview before he died with Luis Palau, the famous evangelist who shared his faith with 1 billion people around the world. And we went, I interviewed him, I tape recorded it, and he died before we were able to get him on camera. But you hear his words in the film, and it's kind of haunting. Here's a guy who's already in heaven. I interviewed him for my book, The Case for Heaven, because I knew he was about to die. He had stage 4 cancer. He had a short time to live. And I wanted to interview someone who knew they were going to be in heaven shortly. And so you actually hear his voice as he talks before he died. And I think it's just powerful. At one point he said to me, Lee, when you get to the end of your life, when all is said and done, you will never regret being courageous for Christ. I mean, I think that's something I carry with me. I hope the listeners will take that to heart and say, yeah, whenever we take a risk for Christ, we'll never regret that at the end of life.
You would have gotten to him before he died if you would have been driving something else other than that 63 guy.
Yeah.
Clunker.
Boy, it was a clunker, I'll tell you.
Yeah, I can't even believe it.
I don't think it had a clutch. It just jammed it into gear.
Yeah. It's like riding a bike. You didn't forget how to drive.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, the whole film is it is unscripted, by the way.
Yeah,
that's
true.
We don't have just a VW bug. We got a VW bus in the film.
Yeah, that's true.
So, like, for those people, here, I'll give the person who wants to invite someone some ammo. You're seeing Lee drive some vintage cars. You're seeing some beautiful cinematic kind of journey type stuff that, hey, it'll help you plan your next vacation. And you're going to learn something,
Lee, who do you think gets a pass? Who gets into heaven? I mean, if you're a 3 or 4 year old kid, do you get a pass?
Great question. I believe that children under the age of accountability, where they don't understand right and wrong and so forth, I believe they'll be in heaven. I think there's evidence in Scripture when David says, his deceased child, baby will not come to him, but he will go to him. And so I think in the justice and fairness of God, the Bible says, will not the judge of all the earth do what's right? And of course, God's going to do what's right. And so I believe that children who die before that age of accountability, we will be with them in heaven. I believe that even like we lost a child in miscarriage many years ago, and I believe that child will be in heaven. And we'll have the joy, I believe. Some people ask, well, how old will we be in heaven? Some people say, well, Jesus was, in his early 30s when he died. We're all going to be in our early 30s in heaven. I don't know. There's nothing in the Bible that tells us one way or the other. But I wonder if those of us who've lost a child through miscarriage or a baby at birth or whatever, might it be in heaven that we'll have the opportunity in a sinless environment, in an environment of perfect love in the presence of God, might we have the opportunity to parent that child and to raise that child? Wouldn't that be something? Mm-hmm. I don't know, but it could be.
Mm-hmm. When you decide to do these projects, well, first of all, there must be a handful along the way where you just couldn't put it together, and you couldn't find the evidence or something. Things just didn't add up. Can you give me one of those?
Well, I think, whenever I
asked him that during the makeup. I was like, how you doing? And he was like, I'm halfway through it. I could kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel. I'm like, do you ever just get stuck and go, man, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do this?
I mean, as a journalist, I'm sure there were stories that never panned out.
Yeah, you go down a lot of blind alleys. Yeah. I mean, you want to look, for instance, when we looked at near-death experiences, there were a lot of cases where people say, oh, yeah, I died. I met Jesus. He's 5'10". He's got brown eyes, real nice guy. I don't know if that's true. I have no way to prove that. I have no way to corroborate that. And so I dismiss that and say, it may or may not be true. I don't know. I can't build any conclusions off of that. And that's why I tried to go for things we could corroborate, things where there's, like, for instance, in the book, I talk about a woman who died actually after a abortion in England. And she was in the hospital. They couldn't stop the bleeding. She died. And she said her spirit rose. She watched the resuscitation efforts. And then when she was revived, she said, by the way, on the ceiling fan in the emergency room, on the top of the blade, there's a red sticker. You couldn't see it when you were in the room because it's on the top of the blade. They got a ladder and they looked up there, and sure enough, there was a red sticker. That kind of corroboration tells me that something is really going on. So I try to be careful. As I say, I went to Yale Law School. I have a Master's of Studies in Law degree. I used to be a professor of First Amendment law at Roosevelt University. So I'm familiar with what constitutes reliable evidence. But one of my heroes when I was a law student was a guy named Sir Lionel Luckhoo. And Sir Lionel was the greatest defense attorney in the world. He was in the Guinness Book of World Records. He won more murder cases as a defense attorney than anybody on the planet. And he was a skeptic about the resurrection of Jesus, like I was. I was an atheist. But somebody said to him, Sir Lionel, by the way, he was knighted twice by Queen Elizabeth, became a member of the Supreme Court of his country. So he understood evidence. He understood what constitutes reliable evidence. But he was a skeptic about the resurrection. Somebody said, well, Sir Lionel, why don't you take your monumental legal skill and apply it to the historical record of the resurrection and come to a conclusion? And he said, well, that makes sense. I will. So he spent years, like I did, investigating the historical data concerning the resurrection of Jesus. And I'll recite to you one sentence he wrote that described his conclusion. He said, I say unequivocally that the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is so overwhelming that it compels acceptance by proof, which leaves absolutely no room for doubt. This from the greatest defense attorney in the world. And so that's the kind of evidence I want. I want evidence that's powerful, that's persuasive, that would even persuade a guy like me who'd been an atheist.
And can I add this, David? Because I think this was something powerful for me. And also in the film, we have a presence of a lot of Latino type figures, but the apologetics. And I think that this film that's kind of like a big foundation of it. And you talked about that. Could you explain a little bit, Lee, like the apologetics of how sometimes we think it's more to debate someone, argue with someone. Yeah. But why is it important that we should be able to explain what we believe?
Especially these days, somebody said recently that evangelism in the 21st century is spelled apologetics. Apologetics, of course, doesn't mean apologize for something. It comes from a Greek word. It's used in 1 Peter 3:15. It says, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do it gently and respectfully. And so, yeah, man, you're right. I mean, it doesn't mean we should go out debating people necessarily, But it does mean that in a gentle and respectful way, we can give answers, give reasons for why we believe we believe. That's giving a defense for the faith. In fact, I've now started a center for evangelism and applied apologetics at Colorado Christian University, where I gathered 40 PhDs from around the country. We've created 91 accredited courses, all 100% online, where people can get a bachelor's degree or a master's degree in apologetics or evangelism, or just take courses for their own edification, their own growth. You may want to take a course on the resurrection or on Islam or on science and faith or on personal evangelism. And so if people go to strobelcenter.com, all the courses are there, all the information's there. But I really believe, as Manny said, that these days in our increasingly skeptical culture, where the internet pumps out all kinds of ridiculous claims and charges against Christianity, we need this stuff. Yeah.
If you notice the statistics, people are listening to podcasts, thought leaders, influencers, you name it.
Yeah.
And I think the reason this hit home for me, and I'm so grateful for it, I've seen it firsthand in my life with my daughter, but also at work.
Yeah, tell about your daughter. Tell about your daughter.
No, put two illustrations, and both little girls. One little girl, her dad said, God doesn't exist. Prove it to me. Show me the evidence. And I wanted to encourage the little girl to say, Dad, you show me the evidence that he doesn't exist, right? Because it lies there. People can see it however they want, but truly, where does the evidence lie? And I know that this film is impactful. Why? Because my daughter, she's 5 years old. She's asked me some really deep apologetic questions. She says, Dad, why does God allow despair? Why did God allow Jesus to die? You know what I mean? And she's 5. But you know what the best feeling as a dad is? And I'm being 100% serious. I knew how to respond to that. Thankfully, because I worked on this project. You know what I mean? Like, we experience God, but we can also know God rationally, right? With the evidence.
Yeah.
So I encourage people, man. So many of us are being, teased, humiliated, or just whatever. But we don't have to fight back and be mean about it. We can just simply display the evidence. And it's a choice. How beautiful is that God gave us a choice?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I don't know. I'm just fired up about that.
Yeah. One friend of mine I met online was talking about his granddaughter who was in a public school, and she's like in kindergarten. And she's on the playground during recess, and the other kids were taunting her because she believes in God. Oh, you believe in fairy tales. You still believe in fairy. This is a kindergartner getting harassed for her faith at age 5 or 6 or whatever you are in kindergarten. And this is our future. This is our future. Generation Z, they say, is the first generation where their default position is not faith, but skepticism. We need to address that. Our children, our grandchildren are going to have questions and doubts, and that's why I write books. That's why we make these movies, that they can be resources for people to say, wait a minute, we have good reasons to believe what we believe. It's not based on wishful thinking, legend, mythology. It's based on a solid foundation of truth.
And I don't think God's afraid of our questions.
Yeah.
And you know what's interesting? There's answer to these questions.
Yeah.
We just need to provide opportunity.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this. We're coming out of the pandemic, and this is the first project you've done coming out of the pandemic.
Yeah.
How did the pandemic impact this project for you?
Hugely, I think. 29% of Americans know someone who's died of COVID during the pandemic. My brother died, was one of the early victims of the pandemic. My wife and I were at a restaurant not long ago, and we got talking to the waitress, and she's about 18 years old, and she started to cry. We said, what's wrong? She said, I'm so sorry. I almost didn't come into work today. We just lost a family member to COVID. So here's an 18-year-old girl who probably never thought about death before, but now death has come knocking on her family's door, and now she's got questions. Now you could see the anxiety in her eyes. She wants to know, what does happen when you close your eyes for the last time in this world? Is there a life to come? And so I think this film and this book at this time, I think in God's providence, it is the one of the most relevant topics that we can talk about. We need to know, I think, with confidence, what does wait for us in the world to come.
Well, yeah, man. It was hard logistically.
Yeah.
Because, all the rules and what you can and can't do, travel is very difficult. We have to schedule a lot of things, and even crew, getting, COVID and things like that.
We have one person in the film who insisted on being interviewed with a mask on.
Yeah. So, It's really a reality picture of what went on. I mean, even one of the writers, both his parents died during the making of the film to COVID.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So, like, I don't say that lightly. What I'm saying is, like, I think the subject matter really helped them as well. You know what I mean? And I think I think a lot of us, especially younger folks, our experience towards death was accelerated.
Yeah.
Because now we know someone who's died.
Yeah.
Versus maybe you see your grandparents, but now it's like young people, all ages.
Yeah.
And it's everywhere. It's on the internet.
Yeah.
So I think for me, the film really just builds this confidence, this hope. It's interesting, the hope. How could there be hope in so much pain?
Yeah.
Only God could do that, man. I mean, and that's why we sonically, visually, musically, it's an experience. You ever have that feeling of like, man, like I don't know what this is. Why, this feeling of hope in the midst of so much darkness or pain. I think the film has that presence in it. And when we deliver with the apologetics and the case and the framework, man, I just think you're learning, but you're also experiencing something very special.
Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, thank you for stopping by. This is going to be great, and it comes out, April 4th, 5th, and 6th?
Right. Those are the only days it's in theater. I just want to encourage people, having seen it on a little computer screen, because they sent me a screener, you got to see it on the big screen, because the cinema, it's just beautiful. It's a beautiful film that Manny created, and so if people go to thecaseforheavenmovie.com, all the information's there. It's in movie theaters all across the country those 3 nights. We hope people take a risk, invite a friend. I already know churches that have rented out theaters already, and just going to invite the congregation to come. At Colorado Christian University, we've rented out a theater. We're inviting the students to come. So we want people to see this film.
Yeah, and then also, I would encourage this too. If you have the means, buy at a theater or tickets and leave them at your neighbor's, house, or someone that can't buy a ticket. Believe it or not, some people can't buy tickets. There's churches that are underprivileged that can't buy. That's where I grew up. I grew up in a Latino immigrant church in South Central LA. So that's what we're doing. My brothers and I, we're going to get a theater and we're going to get the tickets there, because it's actually really hard if you have multiple kids and things like that to bring them to the theater. So let's be generous as well, and let's honestly just bless someone with an opportunity to listen to this.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. It's great seeing you again.
Great to see you again.
Thank you again, Lee and Manny. There have been so many great stories that they have shared with me and all of us today, and that's just scratching the surface. So please check out the film to really experience the evidence for the afterlife and for heaven. Again, it's called The Case for Heaven, and it's only in theaters April 4, 5, and 6. Hey, friends, I would love for you to share this podcast with others, and please do rate and review and give us 5 stars. That would be fantastic. And you can find more podcasts at contagiousInfluencers.com. I think we have about 150 episodes up there right now. And, of course, you can also follow us on Twitter, and or you can go to our Keep the Faith Facebook page or on Instagram. So please do join us on our radio show website as well at KeepTheFaith.com, where you'll find all kinds of great episodes that air on some 300 stations across the country and around the world every day and every week. So please do that. KeepTheFaith.com. I'm David Sams, and you've been listening to CIA, Contagious Influences of America, the podcast from the producers of Keep the Faith. Hey, go out there and live that life in living color, because it sure is a heck of a lot more interesting than living it in black and white. See you next time.